This next tale from Tangled Logic is a classic don't go in the woods story, but with twists that delve into the truly bizarre. Before we venture into this unsettling narrative, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in captivating story format, you've found your ideal destination. That's precisely what we specialize in, and we upload new content 2 or 3 times every week. If that piques your interest, we encourage you to invite the like button over to your kid's birthday party. Then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. When they say yes, put their blindfold on and then replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Headless Valley. Located in the far northwestern section of Canada is the aptly named Northwest Territories. It is a massive swath of land that virtually nobody lives inside of. To make that point crystal clear, consider the following. The country of Germany has a population of 83 million people, give or take. The Northwest Territories is 4 times as large as Germany, but only has a population of about 50,000 people. In addition to being this huge and mostly unoccupied space, the Northwest Territories are almost completely wild. Think dense forests, huge mountains, massive rivers and lakes, and lots of really big animals. Even for highly experienced outdoorsmen and women, the Northwest Territories can be a truly hazardous place. And within this truly hazardous place, there is one part that is the most hazardous. An 11,000 square mile stretch of pure wilderness right in the middle, called the Nahanni Valley. In 1976, the Nahanni Valley was designated a national park. But don't let that fool you. This is not some family park that anybody can go to. There are no tourist accommodations, no hotels, really nothing inside of a tent, no roads that lead into this park. The only way you can get inside this valley is by plane, by boat, or by very stressful and difficult overland hike. But for those who are able and willing to make the effort to get inside of this valley, you have the opportunity to explore one of the most beautiful places on the planet. Because this section of the world is almost completely untouched by man, it is truly nature at its purest form. However, there is a catch. This valley is said to be haunted. Over the last 10,000 years, the handful of native tribes that have attempted to settle inside of the Nahanni Valley have all either suddenly disappeared without a trace, like the Naha tribe, who literally overnight were just gone, leaving behind their shelters, food, and supplies. No one knows what happened to them more. The tribes have abruptly fled. They fled, claiming they were being terrorized or stalked by creatures lurking in the forest, like these white demons and these large wolves they called wahilas. Now, of course, this just sounds like folklore, and it might very well be that that's all it is, folklore. But starting in the early 1900s, some very strange things started happening in the Nahanni Valley that were not folklore. These things happened, and they were horrifying. These were horrifying, real events. And they might, depending on your viewpoint, give credit to some of the theories that the native tribespeople have about this valley, which is there's something evil lurking out in this forest, but we just don't know what it is. In 1904, 3 brothers Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod, all residents of the Northwest Territories, decided they wanted to go looking for gold in the Nahanni Valley. They reasoned that because so few people had ever been inside this valley, if gold was to be found, it certainly hadn't been found yet. So after a very long and arduous journey using sled dogs, trains, and homemade boats, they finally slipped into the valley and found themselves on what's called the Flat River, which runs right through the center of the Nahanni Valley. Now, the Flat River is kind of ironically named because it's anything but flat. It's actually more like a rapid at certain points. But either way, the 3 brothers were on their boat, making their way up the Flat River. At some point, they pulled off onto the riverbank and set up camp. Once their camp was established, they went down to the river and placed their gold sluices in the water. A gold sluice is a long, skinny box, usually made of wood, with a strainer on one side. Gold miners submerge it in the water and shovel sediment from the bottom into a funnel. The big stuff gets stopped by the strainer, and dirt and water flow out the side, trapping gold nuggets inside the sluice. The three brothers got their sluices ready and immediately hit pay dirt. There was tons of gold in this river. So all day and all night they collected gold. The next morning they did the same thing. And by the time all their containers were literally filled to the brim with gold, they decided, hey, let's go back and turn this in, get some money for it, and then come back out here. So they packed up their tent, all their supplies, and put everything back in their boat. They got onto the flat river, and at some point very early in their journey back, the boat capsized. The boat actually broke apart from the strength of the flat river's rapids, and so the boat just sank, along with much of their supplies, including all of their gold. But the three brothers were able to grab some of their supplies, like a rifle, some lumber, and some of their mining equipment, and swam it all to shore. They caught their breath, totally devastated at the loss of the gold, but they were alive. They had enough supplies to survive, so they figured all they could do was maybe try to go back to their original site, try to get some more gold because they still had a sluice, and then try to get out of there. They planned to regroup and come back another time. So, using some of the lumber they recovered from their broken boat, and by cutting down some trees, they literally fashioned another boat. They then hopped back on the flat river and went back up to the site where they'd found gold earlier. They set up their sluice and their camp again, but this time they didn't find any gold. So, after this very disappointing day where they'd already lost all their gold and now weren't finding any more, they decided that night when they went to bed that the next day they were just going to leave. The next day they got up, packed, hopped back on the flat river in this new boat they'd built, and were able to make their way out of the valley and get back to their homes. As soon as they got back home, the two younger brothers, Willie and Frank, started talking about how they wanted to go back into the Nahanni Valley and get more gold. Now they knew there was gold out there. It wasn't a question. Yeah, we didn't find it that second time, but we know it's out there. Charlie, the older brother, wanted the gold, but he felt, hey, that was a close call with the boat flipping over. I don't know if it's a good idea, so I'm actually not going to go. You guys can go, I'm going to stay. Several months passed, and Frank and Willie had been doing all this preparation for their additional trip into the valley. Finally, in 1905, they were ready. So Willie, Frank, and a third man named Robert Weir, a friend who was going to replace Charlie, the three of them made their way up into the valley. They didn't tell anyone how long they were going to be gone for, so when they didn't send any word and no one had heard from them in weeks, Charlie was actually not that concerned. He knew there was lots of gold to be had out in the Nahanni Valley, so he figured they must have struck it rich and decided to live out their long term, or at least maybe through the summer or the next year. So he wasn't concerned, and because he wasn't concerned, nobody else was concerned about these three men. Weeks turned into months, turned into a year, and still no one had heard from these three men. No one had heard from Willie, Frank, or from Robert. But still, Charlie maintained that nothing could be wrong because there were three of them out there. They were incredibly experienced. There was a ton of gold out there, and Charlie was sure they were just killing it, acquiring all this gold, and he expected to see them in the next couple of months, maybe, and everything would be just fine. But a whole other year would go by so. They'd been out there for 2 years. No one had heard from them. At this point, Charlie thought to himself, okay, I have to go out and see if they're okay. So he rounded up 4 other people from his town and mounted an expedition to head back into the Nahanni Valley to find his 2 brothers and Robert Weir. Charlie and a search party eventually, after yet another long and arduous journey, got into Nahanni Valley and onto the flat river. So they started making their way upstream along the flat river, which must have been a very treacherous journey getting through the rapids of this river. The whole time they were scanning the left and right sides, hoping to see some sign of life. looking for any indication that these three men were out here and just fine, but they didn't see any sign of them. So they finally made their way all the way up to the very end of Flat River, or I should say the very beginning of Flat River. This is where it breaks off from a much larger river called the South Nahanni River. Once they turned onto the South Nahanni River, they began going downstream. Again, they were looking on either side for any sign of these three men, but there was no sign of them. Then the river they were on took a very sharp turn. It's actually called the Big Bend, about a 45-degree turn. As soon as you make that turn, it dumps you into this 10-mile stretch of river called Second Canyon. Now, along the South Nahanni River, which is about 350 miles long, there are these 4 canyons that the water passes through. They're labeled 4th Canyon, 3rd Canyon, 2nd Canyon, and 1st Canyon. These canyons are massive. The sheer cliffs on either side of the river shoot up to 3,000 feet above the water, and in some parts, the water is actually just as deep, thousands of feet deep. Second Canyon is unique because the cliff faces are as sheer as you're going to get, and the cliff face almost butts up exactly against the water. So there's really very little shoreline on either side. Once you're in this 10-mile stretch, you're basically boxed in. You have thousands of feet of water below you, these massive cliffs on either side, and really nowhere to go. You need to get through this section of the river before you can effectively get onto the shoreline and take a break from being in your boat. Along these cliffs are these openings you see high up all over the cliffs on both sides. That are openings to these massive cave systems inside of these thousands of feet tall cliffs. Because of how difficult it is to not only get to Nahanni Valley, but also to get up to these different cave openings, nobody's gone inside of them. We don't know what's inside of these caves, save for the few that are low enough for people to explore. As you're passing through Second Canyon, it's almost like you're being watched because there are all these openings, but you can't see into them. You're just forced to go down this 10-mile stretch, and you can't really go anywhere. Whatever's watching you, it's watching you. As soon as Charlie and his search party entered into Second Canyon, it would have immediately gotten darker because that's another characteristic of being in Second Canyon. These huge cliff walls of this canyon obscure the sunlight, so they would have entered this canyon and it would have gotten darker. It's very windy inside of Second Canyon, so the winds would have picked up. It was a dark, very strange setting for them to be in, and they would have been looking on either side at these little strips of shoreline, barely big enough for a boat, looking for any sign of life. But they didn't see anything. As they were making their way down this 10-mile stretch, getting closer and closer to actually entering into First Canyon, the next canyon they would enter, the sides of the river started to get slightly larger. Here, you could actually berth your boat, and there were some trees. On the left-hand side, right before exiting Second Canyon, they noticed there was actually a tent perched within some trees. So the search party naturally went right over to the shoreline and hopped out. But as soon as they stepped foot on land and had a clearer view of this tent and what was outside of it, they noticed there was a body clearly lying on the ground outside of the tent. So Charlie and the search party ran over, and as soon as they were up close, they could tell this body was missing its head. They saw the clothes on this body were totally charred and burned. Whoever this was, they were reaching with their right arm when they died, and just beyond the reach of their right arm was a rifle propped up against a tree. So they walked around this one body and went around towards the back side of the tent, where the opening to this tent was, and they found another body, another very badly decomposed body. It was positioned halfway in the tent and halfway out of the tent, and there was a blanket partially obscuring this person's body. When they moved to the blanket, they saw this body too was missing its head. So Charlie and the search party continued to search around the camp in hopes of finding the heads of these two people to try to figure out who they were. But they never found the heads. However, they did find some personal effects, both in the pockets of these two bodies and inside the tent, that would confirm these were Charlie's brothers. As for the third man who had been with them, Robert Weir, he was not at the campsite, and in fact, he would never actually be found officially. However, A little ways down the river, another partial skeleton would be found several months later that was attributed to Robert. However, that was not 100% confirmed to be Robert. The only other interesting thing that was found at this campsite was a carving in a nearby tree. And it just said, "We have found a fine prospect," indicating that Charlie's brothers had found gold. But there was no gold either on them, or in their camp, or in the river nearby. Nothing. There was no gold. Charlie and a search party would leave the valley and get in touch with the mounted police, who would come out to the site where the brothers had been found. They would launch an investigation and ultimately conclude that all three of these men, the two brothers and Robert, had starved to death. Then, after they had perished, animals had taken them off, which is why Robert was found so far away and why these skulls were missing from the two brothers. Now, Charlie did not believe that. He believed they had been attacked by native tribes in the area, but the police were not buying that. They said this was a natural thing. This was an accident, and so that's that. When the story of these two decapitated men made the news, people went crazy about this. People were very divided about what they thought really happened. There was a percentage of people who believed that partial skeleton that was found was not Robert Weir. They thought he had not died. He had murdered the two brothers, decapitated them, and then made off with their gold. The other percentage of people believed that all three men, the two brothers and Robert, had been attacked by a person. A group of people, an animal, a creature, something. There was some sort of attack, and that's why the two brothers were in those positions that indicated they had encountered something horrifying, with one brother reaching for the gun and the other appearing to have leaped from his bed before he ultimately died. But regardless of which side you fell on, pretty much everybody at the time who heard about the story became terrified of the Nahanni Valley. So, right after he got there, he set up his sluices and started mining for gold, and apparently he found a lot of it. He sent word back to his partners outside of the valley that he had made it rich. So his partners were really excited to meet up with him the following summer and see how much he got, because they planned on going back into the valley with him that summer. So that summer rolls around. His partners go to the meeting spot right outside the valley, but Martin doesn't show up. So his partners stayed outside at this meeting space for several days until finally, when he didn't show up, they decided, we have to go in there and see if he is okay, because at this point, he should have been here. There's no excuse. So they ended up going into the Nahanni Valley. They made their way up the flat river and went roughly to the area where they knew he was staying, based on the message he had sent earlier. He had described where he was staying. So they actually found his cabin, or I should say, they found what was left of his cabin. His cabin had been completely torched, burned to the ground, and laying on the ground next to the burned-out cabin were the burned-out remains of another headless corpse. And this corpse belonged to Martin Jorgensen. The police did a thorough investigation, but they were never able to determine what actually killed him. The police did not connect Martin's death with the two McLeod brothers' deaths. Even though they were all decapitated, they were in roughly the same area, and it happened within a few years of each other, and they looked very, very similar. Even though that all was true, the police said, nope, these are totally separate. Martin died for some reason, and then animals took parts of him away, and that's why his skull is missing. Martin's skull was never located, and the gold that Martin claimed to have struck it rich with was also not at the cabin, not on him. There was no gold anywhere in the vicinity. When Martin's death made the news, people went crazy. And despite the police assuring everyone that his death was not connected to the McLeod brothers' deaths, even though the police were saying that the public didn't see it that way, it was just too easy to connect one decapitation with two other decapitations that had happened close together in a relatively short time frame. So a lot of people assume there must be a killer on the loose somewhere in the Nahanni Valley. 7 years later, in 1921, the rumors of a killer on the loose were still alive and well when gold prospector John O'Brien and his partner decided, you know what? Despite the rumors of the so-called killer or whatever's going on in the Nahanni Valley, Let's go into the Nahanni Valley and try our hand. Let's try to get some gold." So the two of them made their way into the valley and they set up camp in Headless Valley, not far from where the McLeod brothers had been found decapitated. So they set up their camp and they were there for a couple of days, doing well, finding gold. And then at some point, John told his partner that he was going out to check all of their traps along the river and he'd be back in about 8 or 9 days. So his partner waited 8 or 9 days and John didn't come back. A couple of days after that passed, and now John was past due. So the partner decided he had to go out looking for him. There was another gold prospector in the area, so this partner contacted him. And the two of them went to the river and began walking upstream until they found John. He had frozen to death. But the way he was positioned was very interesting. He was sitting in front of this obviously previously lit campfire. He wasn't hunched over. He didn't look like he was in pain. He looked like he was just enjoying the fire. There was nothing on his face that indicated discomfort, pain, or fear. He was even holding the matchbook in his hand. It was like he was just sitting there, enjoying the fire, when something caused him to suddenly freeze. In fact, witnesses would say John looked like he had been flash frozen, as if it had happened in a matter of seconds, because it didn't look like he had reacted properly to freezing to death. And the police, when they came out, would say, "You know, this is odd. This is odd the way he's positioned, but ultimately he died because he froze to death. So there's no foul play here, and so no further investigation was needed." 5 years later, in 1926, a hunting party that included a young woman named Annie Lafferty was camping out along the flat river inside of Headless Valley. That night, they were all kind of joking around the fire, and then at some point, they decided to all go to sleep. The next day, when everybody got up, Annie was no longer in camp. There was no sign of where she went. So they began by yelling out and walking around the immediate vicinity to see if maybe she had stepped away for a minute. But Annie was just gone. No one knew where she went. So the hunting party spent the rest of the day looking for Annie, but there was no sign of her. They ultimately left the valley and told police. Police came out. There was a huge search, but Annie was never found. Several months later, a man named Charlie, who happened to have been out near Flat River, near this hunting party, when they were out there, but Charlie himself was not in the hunting party. He didn't know Annie. He was just in the vicinity, overheard someone talking about a member of that hunting party, specifically a woman, going missing. When he heard that, he knew he had to tell police what he had seen that night out near Flat River. So he went to police and explained that night, when he knew there was this hunting party over there, he could hear them. He knew they were over there, he said. At some point he went to bed and then he woke up when he heard the sound of rocks falling into the river in front of him. He was sleeping along the river's edge, so he sat up and looked out across the river. It was totally dark, but there was some moonlight, and he was kind of looking around, wondering what was causing the sound, but he couldn't see it. And then he heard it again, and you could tell it was off to his left. These weren't huge rocks. These were like medium to small-sized rocks, like rocks you could just pick up and throw. And so he was looking, and all of a sudden, he saw maybe a couple 100 yards away, through some sparse trees, a naked woman, white, naked woman, running on all fours up this mountainside. As she was running up the mountainside, her feet and hands were knocking little rocks into the river down below. She was right on the edge of this cliff. As she was running up this hill, she stopped and she turned, and he got a good look at her face. And Charlie would say he was so taken aback by her face. It looked like she was possessed. There was something wrong with her face. So Charlie instinctively ducked down and chose not to follow her, even though he knew anybody running naked anywhere in the wilds is doomed. But he felt like he could not go near this woman. There was something wrong with this woman. So the police took the story down and said, "Hey, you know, this is what Annie looked like." And Charlie would say, I think that's her. I think that matches her description." And so, universally, it's believed this woman galloping up this hillside in the middle of the night, naked, was Annie. The police ultimately would not investigate Annie's disappearance any further because, at the time Charlie was telling them this piece of information, she had already been gone for months, and the assumption was she was dead. 4 years later, in 1931, another gold prospector decided to try their luck in Headless Valley. A man named Phil Powers made his way into the valley. He found a spot off a flat river. He built a cabin, and then, shortly thereafter, his cabin burned to the ground with him inside of it. Now, his skeleton was intact, but the strange thing about his death is, based on the origin of the fire, which would have been on the roof. He should have had an opportunity to climb out of the cabin before it burned down, giving rise to the theory that he was actually dead before the fire started. However, the police said this was an accident caused by Phil doing something with the stovepipe that led to it catching on fire, and this was just all one big accident. But the vast majority of people that have followed along to this point with all of these strange deaths, they were just not buying it. 5 years later, in 1936, 2 more gold prospectors, William Epler and Joseph Mulholland, entered the Headless Valley to try their luck. Shortly after arriving and getting set up, they went missing. A search party came out to look for them, and they found their cabin. And just like Phil Powers, it had burned to the ground. But William and Joseph were not in the ashes. They were not anywhere nearby. In fact, they were never found. No one has any idea what happened to them, and no one knows what caused the fire. 9 years later, in 1945, yet another gold prospector named Ernest Savard entered the Headless Valley to go looking for gold. When he did not leave the valley for an intended rendezvous with some of his partners went looking for him. And they would find him inside of a sleeping bag, laying down, decapitated right along the flat river inside of the Headless Valley. So the police would come out, they would do an investigation, and they would call this an accident. They concluded that he had starved to death or died of hypothermia. And then, after he was dead, animals must have come in and removed his skull, which is why they couldn't find it. So the police did not, at least not publicly, connect his death to all of the other decapitations in that small area. 1 year later, in 1946, another gold miner named John Patterson went into Headless Valley, and he went missing. So the search party went in looking for him, and John would never be found. But on one of the last nights that the search party was in the Headless Valley, they were camping out near Flat River. Some native tribespeople came into their camp and warned them about some white figures that were walking around the valley that night. They're down near the river. They're out in the forest. They're kind of all around here. And so you really need to be careful. You don't want them to see you. And then these tribespeople just left. So the search party was absolutely horrified. They knew about the rumors of this place. They were out here looking for someone that had gone missing in this place. All night, all they heard were distant howls and screams that they hadn't heard on previous nights. They were hearing these wailing sounds coming from all around them, like these things that were out there were intentionally trying to scare them to get them to leave. It felt like they were not supposed to be there. The next day, first thing when they got up and they left, the leader of that search party would say he just felt like the whole valley was totally sinister and that constant wailing they heard the night before. He said he will never forget. From the mid-1940s onward, there have been far less strange incidents reported inside of Nahanni Valley. But one could attribute that to the fact that far fewer people have been going into Nahanni Valley ever since the 1940s. And in recent times, huge segments of the park have been permanently closed. The park has said the reason they're doing that is to protect that segment of the park. But other people have speculated that at least part of the reason why they're closing these segments, many of which are right near the Headless Valley, is because they're trying to protect people from getting anywhere near whatever it is that's lurking inside of that park. But regardless, it is still a fact that over the last century, There have been dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have either gone missing or who have died under very mysterious circumstances inside of this valley. And the truth is, nobody knows why. This tale of the Nahanni Valley, with its chilling disappearances and unexplained deaths, serves as a stark reminder of the mysteries that lie hidden in the world's untamed places. The stories passed down through generations, combined with documented tragedies, paint a disturbing picture of a wilderness that holds secrets beyond our comprehension. We encourage you to share your theories on what truly lurks within the Headless Valley in the comments below. If you found this journey into the strange and mysterious compelling, please remember to invite the like button to your kid's birthday party and then ask them if they want to hit the piñata. After you get their blindfold on, replace the piñata with a beehive. Also, please subscribe to Tangled Logic and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Your continued support allows us to explore these fascinating and often terrifying true stories. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and stay safe.